We are live. Good morning. So thanks for those that have joined early. We'll get started here just briefly. A few housekeeping items. As a reminder, if you are logged in with us live, the chat feature in YouTube is how we love to interact with our audience as much as we can. To be logged into that, you need to be logged in with a YouTube account or a Gmail account, and then you can chat your questions in live. We've got Adam and Jennifer here with us as usual, so Adam will be moderating and monitoring for questions. So we always give preferential treatment to questions that come in live. We've got a few questions that have come in since the previous session, as well as a few topics that just general topics that we want to cover. Behind me on the board here, my cell number, if you want to text a question to me. I do not monitor my phone during the broadcast, so that'll be saved for later. My email address, if you have any suggestions for topics, improvements, other feedback general to ask the agronomist. So with that, we'll go ahead and get things kicked off here this morning. I've already had a picture text to me this morning of rootless corn, so we'll touch on that here with the dryness that we're experiencing. If you planted early or you've received showers in the last couple weeks, probably not a big issue for you. If you planted later, planted wet, maybe planted no-till planted and the seed slot cracked back open, or if you're in an area that is extremely dry, rootless corn is something that can occur. Basically, when the nodal corn roots start to establish at V2, V3, those nodal roots, there's three things they can't grow into. They can't grow into soil that's as hard as concrete. They can't grow into soil that is bone dry, and they can't grow into air. So if you don't have good seed to soil contact in that nodal region around the roots, or if the soil that is contacting that region around the roots is extremely dry, those nodal roots will not form. Plants grow visibly, they look normal up until about V5, V6 typically, or if you have a little bit of a wind, maybe about V4, they start to flop over. So the common term for rootless corn would be floppy corn. So floppy corn syndrome or rootless corn syndrome. There's really only two cures for that. Neither one of them are ideal, but you need to hope for rain. So if you get that soil moistened around those roots, those nodal roots can go ahead and start to grow. Or if it's going to stay dry, the best thing you can do is try to cultivate some loose soil, if you can find any loose soil, around the base of those plants, and that will do two things. It will, fill in the cracks, fill in the holes, provide some better seed to soil contact. You can't create moisture doing that. Obviously, you're going to lose moisture doing that. So we really can't replace that as well. So just want to touch on that. That was one thing that had come in from a grower here this morning. Also, it had a request from a grower that
might comment. Seed is one of those things we always get beat up on planting depth. And seed gate all that rootless corn issue, but it will help.
Yes. So Adam's comment on planting depth is extremely appropriate for that conversation as well. You can't, obviously there's nothing you can do about it after the fact. But another one of the reasons that we recommend a good solid 2-inch planting depth for corn is shallow planted corn is far more likely to experience rootless corn than corn planted at a proper depth. So the photo period sensitive soybeans, if you've got determinate soybeans, aren't as photoperiod sensitive, can be different. But basically that's why soybeans, if they're growing in constant light, never really mature normally, and eventually you just mow through green beans with a combine and or shred them down or whatever you do. But there's really no point when you're harvesting to go around the beans. They're growing around the pole light and think that when they're ready in a couple of weeks, you'll come back and cut them, because they won't be ready then either. So it's really challenging for people that have fields next to municipal areas with well-lit streets. I've seen some small fields on the edge of Galesburg where there's street lights that line the road. And back in April or May, when we also had 10 hours of dark, and then the night length got shorter than that, and then it starts lengthening back out. So those soybeans that were planted early enough, they got triggered to start to flower by sensing the proper length of night earlier in the season. And then it takes some time for basically that trigger initiates the meristematic tissue to produce a flower instead of producing vegetative growth. And then you have to have a certain number of heat units that you collect after that trigger before you see that flower developing. And really the basis of why this is special and why this is a good thing, getting those flowers earlier on soybeans, initiating flowering earlier in the season, having that plant in the R1, R2 stage for a greater number of days, and also having that plant flowering in a part of the year when we typically have better growing conditions. So, usually late June, early July is kind of about the best, environment we're going to have from a sunlight, temperature, moisture environment situation. So having that soybean plant reproductive during the best weather we're going to receive during the year, having it reproductive for more days, research has also shown that that's primarily where the additional yield potential is coming from for early planted soybeans. They spend more days of their life in a reproductive phase than soybeans that are planted later do. And you want to spend the most days you can capturing sunlight that you can feed a flower, feed a pod, feed a seed, and minimize the number of days that sunlight that you're capturing is just feeding leaves and roots and shoots. So getting that plant reproductive sooner and having it in a reproductive phase for a greater number of days during the growing season is what gives us our increased yield potential on early planted soybeans. So that's the best I can do here, explaining how we get early flowers in soybeans. That's really what you want. If you can get your beans planted early enough that they can flower the first week of June, that's a good thing. And if you see that, that's really what you want to see. So hopefully that explains that for anyone who's been confused about that. Go to University of Wisconsin Extension, Dr. Conley, Cool Bean website, lots of good resources there, and probably has written as much on that topic as anybody I know.
So Lance, we've come upon a little dry spell here.
Yes.
And a lot of questions leading up to that and going through that have happened in the countryside with different growers. One thing I think I would like you to hit on before we got to this dry spell, though, is RGS, rapid growth syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
Not a big deal, but I've had a few guys ask me about it. If you want to talk a little bit about what that is and what was going on in our cornfields, and we can see some of that wacky growth activity.
Right. So rapid growth syndrome basically is when it's a little, I'll call it a hormonal imbalance, and generally it occurs when you've got ideal growing conditions and very rapid. So you've got good moisture, you've got lots of sunlight. Happens more often on the edge of fields where you've got even more sunlight. And basically that plant the world doesn't unfurl properly, so it gets kind of twisted up, starts to grow in a crook or bend over in the field because that whorl is not unfurling properly. And a lot of times you don't notice it at that stage because the field's still green, and if you're in the field scouting, you'll see it. But if you're just doing a drive-by, you're probably not going to notice it. What becomes noticeable in a drive-by is when that plant does finally unwrap, that whorl has been wrapped so tight bent over in kind of a shepherd's crook, that those leaves that have been tightly wrapped in that whirl really haven't seen any sunlight. And so they're not green. So when they unwrap, they're yellow. And so you see these scattered yellow leaves across the field. Looks a little bit alarming. At that point, the worst is over, because that means the plant has unwrapped, because until it unwraps, you won't see the yellow leaf. So when you see those yellow leaves, it probably was actually struggling more a few days before you saw the yellow leaves than it is when you see the yellow leaves. But when you walk out there to figure out what's going on, you'll probably find other plants that haven't unfurled yet, that are still wrapped up tight. That's what Adam's referring to as rapid growth syndrome. There are hybrid differences. I've seen situations, split planter, where some hybrids will do it worse than others. So there is a genetic component to it. It really doesn't, in my opinion, cause any damage. It just tells you that you've had an excess of resources. You've had really good growing conditions. It's a little bit like tillering. Tillering is kind of the same thing. If you've got excess light, low populations, plenty of moisture, plenty of nutrition, ideal conditions for vegetative growth, that sometimes will stimulate tillers as well. In corn, they're often called suckers. It's an unfortunate name because it implies that they're stealing something from the main plant, when really they're not. They are part of the main plant. And other than being kind of ugly and unsightly, they're not really doing any damage. But so rapid growth syndrome is kind of falls into that same category to me. One of those odd things you see that looks kind of ugly, doesn't really hurt too much. Occasionally you can have a plant that gets wrapped up so tight that they really never get completely normal looking. And those leaves that formed when they were wrapped tightly are always going to have a twist to them. So that leaf, even when the plant gets unwrapped and gets straightened back up and can grow, normally, those leaves are still going to look a little funky, but they're still healthy. They're still photosynthesizing. Just because the leaf's got a twist to it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not functional. So not really something that you need to do anything about. Just one of those things that when you see it, don't get alarmed. Don't think it's some sort of reaction to a herbicide. I have not seen, we mentioned it's kind of hormonally controlled. I don't think use of growth regulating herbicides, I've never really seen a situation where that induces it or makes it worse or triggers it, or I don't really think there's any correlation there at all. But Adam, anything else you want to add to that conversation?
Yeah, no, I think you hit it on the head for the most part. It seems like I'll notice it a bit more when we've had cold, wet conditions where the plant isn't growing.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like, to make an analogy, it's almost like the plant has built up a spring.
Mm-hmm.
It's got a lot of capability, but it's not growing due to lack of heat and sometimes sunlight. And then all of a sudden, when you hit it with a lot of heat and sunlight, that seems to really grow things out of control, and
right.
You can get some of those abnormal growth habits, but not something to be concerned about.
It's
at all.
It's very, very common in sweet corn. I see it probably more in sweet corn than I do in field corn, but not really anything to be alarmed about.
So a lot of that stuff is kind of behind us now, at least in some of the earlier planted corn. We saw some of that RGS popping up in a place or two that I had some questions about, but now we're getting into this dry spell.
Right.
So everybody's concerned about what's going on with this dry weather. Is it hurting our crop? At what stages do we need to be concerned with our corn in particular, that this is going to cause us much yield deficit at the end of the year?
Right. Yeah. So we're worried about corn rolling in a different way now with the drought conditions. Hopefully we've got chances of moisture coming. We do have, I think, pretty good subsoil moisture in most areas. And if your crop was planted early and got off to a good start and was able to root down into moisture and has a good, well-developed root system, that plant is not under a tremendous amount of stress. The plants that are under the most stress are the later planted crops, the crops growing on tougher soils, The plants growing in soils that are more challenging to establish roots in, plants that were growing in areas of the field that were way too wet in May. And probably the worst case scenario is if you had a plant that was either planted late or got off to a tough start, was in a really, really wet soil, really just kind of hanging on in that wet soil, not really thriving in that wet soil, couldn't establish a good root system because that soil was too wet. And now it desperately needs that good root system that it doesn't have. And now it is kind of bound up in that, top foot of soil, which is extremely hard in some cases and extremely dry in some cases. Plenty of moisture at depth, but if you don't have a lot of roots at depth, it's very hard to get those roots to that moisture when they're bound up tight in that shallow layer that is so hard and so dry in some cases. So I did want to make some comments referencing a video that my colleague Chris Carlisle posted a week ago that kind of put my no-till soybeans in a bit of a bad light. Chris, I got some no-tillers that want to string you up, by the way, for that video. So we often see this, frankly, and unfortunately, it does impact no-till more because they get off to a slower start. And even though those no-till fields in theory have more moisture available to that growing crop, if you get off to a slower start and if you don't get rooted down and then it gets hot and dry, you're really kind of stuck living in that hot, dry soil because you don't have as good a deeper root system developed. And really what those fields need is a little drink right now to kind of alleviate the stress, soften that soil up, replenish that shallow soil moisture, enable those plants to get that root system developed, and they'll be able to grow through what they're dealing with today. But to answer Adam's question directly, generally speaking, June is a pretty good time of year to be dry. So my favorite time of year to be dry would be April. My second favorite time of year to be dry would be October and November. And my third favorite time of year to be dry would be June. My least favorite times to be wet would be April and May, and then followed by fall. The time you want to be wet is really August, September, July to a certain extent. Most of our, really the way God designed our weather pattern is just about perfect for growing crops. I mean, the months that we need it to be moist, July, that's the month that we typically get the most moisture. June is a pretty, I won't say it's not an important time for the crop, but there's not as much critical stuff going on for yield determination in June as there is in July, August, other times of the summer. So you've probably heard the saying, a dry June makes good corn. I don't necessarily know that I totally subscribe to that theory. I would say it's probably more accurately said, a wet June makes bad corn. Because when you're wet in June, basically all that's doing is inhibiting root growth and wasting nitrogen. Both things that are going to penalize that crop later in the season. A dry June conserves nitrogen and allows that corn root system to develop as it should. So I don't necessarily subscribe to the theory that corn plants are intelligent enough to know that it's dry and to know that they need to grow more roots because it's dry and know that they need to root deeper because it's dry. I just think a corn plant grows roots, and a corn plant's going to grow roots unless something prevents it from growing roots. And it can't grow roots into a wet, saturated soil. So in wet Junes, when we get shallow rooted corn, because, and people say, well, it had plenty of moisture, it didn't need deep roots. Well, it wasn't so much that. It can't grow roots when the soil is saturated. When the soil is aerated, when the soil has good moisture, but not excessive amounts of moisture, that's good for root growth and development. So those roots are going to just keep growing. They're just going to grow until they reach their ultimate length, or they hit groundwater and stop growing because, again, they can't grow into water, or they hit a subsoil layer that's restrictive that they can't grow through. When you dig a soil pit and there's corn roots down to 7+ feet deep, typically your root depth below ground should be similar to the height of the crop of above ground, unless something prevented those roots from growing. So again, I keep skirting Adam's question, not because I'm trying to duck it, just because I get myself sidetracked. So what's going on as far as yield determination in a corn crop today is row length is being determined. So we've already determined rows around. So if your corn was genetically and environmentally destined to have an 18 row ear, can't change that now. It's locked in at 18. It might have locked in at 14. It might have locked in at 16. It might have locked in at 20. It might have locked in at 22. And I'll be honest, I'll probably irritate some people when I say this. I don't really care which one of those you locked in at. That's one of the factors that determines kernel number per ear, but it's not the ultimate factor that determines kernel number per ear. So row length is what's going on now. And are we going to set a potential of 50 or 40 or 30 or, heaven forbid, 20? Where are we going to end up here is what we're determining now. So if June is really stressful and your crop is really struggling, and you get up in the morning and you're having your morning cup of coffee and you're enjoying the beautiful morning air, and you see corn that's rolled up when you're having that first morning cup of coffee and it's 67 degrees and pretty comfortable out, that's a sign that crop is really being hurt. And if you're getting hurt, what that means is you're sliding down this scale here. Now, when you're enjoying the morning air, you're a fat guy like me, the morning air is usually the best air. That's the best part of the day. I see Adam laughing. He knows what I'm talking about. So, anyway, when you're admiring that corn crop in the morning and it looks the way you want it to look, even if by 11 or noon or 1 or 2 in the afternoon, it looks like a pineapple plantation and it's got that ugly evergreen, dark blue or green, not really corn green color, and the leaves are rolled up tight. That's that plant conserving moisture because it's in a moisture deficit situation, but it's really not being hurt at that point. So I don't think we're sliding down this scale when that's going on. We're really only sliding down this scale when it looks tough in the morning. And even if we do slide down on this scale, so let's say you had potential to be 50, and let's say we slide back to 40 is the best you can get, we haven't got to pollination yet. Pollination is typically what makes all this irrelevant. And the reason it makes all this irrelevant is this is usually when we experience the most amount of stress. And if you were genetically able to do 40, but you only get good enough weather at pollination to fertilize and fill 35, it wouldn't have mattered if you were at 50. Because if you went from 40 down to 35, you'd have just went from 50 down to 35. So what happens out here tends to be what kind of makes this, irrelevant's a strong term. It's not irrelevant, but you're going to have an environment that'll support a certain amount of length on that ear. And regardless of how much potential length you have, it's the environment that you have here that's going to determine your yield. Now, where this would limit your yield is, let's say you go through a tough June. Let's say you hurt your yield potential all the way back to 30 long. So if you've got a lot of weed competition, if you had nutrient issues, if you had severe drought stress, you are going to reduce that potential ear length. And then if the weather gets good at pollination time, and you get all 30 of these, and you'd have had weather that would have supported 40, you can't get them back at that point. So if you have perfect weather conditions at pollination and very low stress grain fill period, and you could have filled 40 long, but you only had 30 long because of the stress that you went through back in June, then we've lost yield potential. And that's a scenario where the only mechanism you have to try to regain some of that is to make huge kernels, which the plant will do. But it can only compensate for lack of kernels with kernel size to a certain extent. So to circle back to answer Adam's question, finally, I don't particularly worry about the levels of stresses that we're seeing currently. I think, the only bad thing, and I joke about this, the only bad thing about a dry June is if a dry June turns into a dry July. If we go through June extremely dry and we get to pollination and we're still dry and it just keeps getting drier and we do not get, some good moisture, we've gotten ourselves into a situation here where we're going to need timely rains through July. We can't store up a year's worth of moisture. I don't care how good your roots are. Timely rains is always preferable over getting more than you need early and hoping you can store it for later. That just doesn't work very good at all. You're far better off to be in a drought all year long and get rain when you need it. The only problem with that is we can't always get it when we need it. But that's some of my frustration as an agronomist. Some of my frustration with grain markets is, how reactionary they are to what the weather is today and what the weather forecast is today. Nothing bad is happening yet. We could still raise a tremendous crop, if we get timely rains. We could still have a disaster if we don't get any rain. We really don't know which one of those two scenarios is going to happen. Most likely it's going to be somewhere in between because that's typically the way it goes. But if we're going to trade on speculation, that's what we do. So I guess that's my thoughts on the dry weather. I'll comment on soybeans quickly. We always used to say that August is the month that makes or breaks our soybeans. That is largely true if you still plant beans, mid-May and later. What we've learned in recent years is that if you plant soybeans, mid-May and earlier, then July starts to become a pretty important month for soybeans. And that's another advantage that early planted soybeans have, because if you just think about, what's July usually like in Illinois? Humid, wet, rainy, uncomfortably hot, steamy, humid, but usually we get more rain in July. July is typically our wettest month, and that works out good for our corn crop. Also works out good for your soybean crop if you plant early. What's August like? Usually hot and dry. Normal August rainfall for us is about 2.5 inches of moisture. So which month would you rather have your future riding on, July or August? I'd pick July every time. So having those beans reproductive earlier in the season, taking advantage of that better weather that's available earlier in the season. So July and August are more important for soybeans. July is the critical month for corn. So I would say, other than it's reducing their vegetative growth, which has really no bearing on yield potential, typically, soybeans are really suffering even less than corn with the dry weather that we're having in June. So I'm not terribly worried about. The only thing I'm worried about on the soybean side is getting herbicide applications made, getting volunteer corn controlled, getting water hemp controlled, getting overlapped residuals activated. Really it's probably weed control that starts to suffer from a dry June in soybeans rather than yield potential. So that would probably be a little bigger concern for me.
Yeah, I completely agree with your synopsis. I'm not real worried about most of the earlier planted corn and soybean right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're in good shape still. Obviously, having a little rain shower would be nice, but we're not hurting yet. One question and conversation that I had related to this, though, is, let's say we continue to have this dry weather, we start to see some symptomology in our crop of not only drought stress, but also maybe some nutrient stresses due to lack of moisture and being able to get nutrients into the plant. Guys are asking me, what do you think we should do? Should we be going out there trying to top dress things? Should we be trying to go out there and side dress things with a Hagee or something like that? What's your thoughts on that, Lance?
Yeah, so nutrient deficiencies definitely more common when it gets dry. Especially our macronutrients, so our nitrogen, P, K, sulfur, those nutrients that are being taken up through the soil, through the roots from the soil, they become far less available to the plant when it's dry. And so those are the first nutrient deficiencies that show up. Nitrogen, sulfur, potassium, probably the most common three. I really, very rarely would I make a side dress recommendation to try to apply supplemental nutrients when we're seeing lack of nutrients due to drought stress conditions, because the soil does not need more nutrient. The soil just needs more water. The plant does not. The plant does need more nutrient, but the nutrient's there. It just can't get it because it's dry. And if you go out and broadcast, something on the soil surface and it stays dry, it's going to do no good whatsoever. If you knife or inject in a liquid nutrient and it stays dry, it's going to do no good whatsoever. If you get the moisture to get some benefit from the additional applied nutrient, you're going to have better availability of the nutrients that were already there. So in that scenario, probably minimal benefit to the additional application. So very, very, very rarely, only in an instance where, let's say you discover you didn't apply nitrogen or something crazy like that. If you discover that, oh gosh, I'm not only deficient because it's dry, I'm deficient because we screwed something up. Maybe in extreme scenario like that, I would recommend a side dress application. Side dressing, typically, if we're talking about nitrogen, has its biggest benefits in wet years. It actually is typically detrimental in a dry year, and it's not detrimental because the side dressing hurt per se. It's detrimental because if it's going to be dry, you want it all front loaded. You want it all out there early. You want all that nitrogen in the soil so that it can get in a plant available form early in the season when there's moisture there. Because if you apply nitrogen late and it's dry, it cannot get into a plant available form without moisture. And it cannot get to a place in the soil profile where the plant can get to it without soil moisture. So in the absence of soil moisture, late nutrient applications are going to be essentially just something that frustrates you and costs you money, will not do anything to benefit the crop.
So had a couple of conversations with several different growers that got some beans planted later.
Yeah.
And, we were having the observation that some of those beans, let's say we planted 140,000, say 18, 20,000 of them emerged, came up. The rest of them were all sitting in dry ground. Just looked beautiful, just like you just took them out of the bag and put them in the ground.
Store them in a dry place.
Yeah. So we're having some good conversation with a couple different growers about whether or not going out there and trying to interseed some more beans to get your stand going was a good idea or not, and whether or not those beans were still viable and going to be fine. And my conversation with them is I assured them those beans will be fine. They just need rain. But the comment came up as, well, what if we need to thicken them up because it's getting later in the season and when we planted them? Is it worth going out there due to, later in the season, you want more beans, you get less vegetative growth and all this. Is it worth going out there and interseeding some more beans, wondering when it's going to get a rain to try and get them out, and you might need a higher population?
So unfortunate situation there that there's really, once again, the best solution to that would be rain. Understand that that's not within our control. I would hesitate to recommend going out and adding seed in that scenario. My first question is, okay, so the first time you planted it at an inch deep, they should have been 2 inches deep and they probably would have all come up. But now, that it's even drier, a 2 inch planting depth probably will not get you into moisture in a lot of cases. So is your planter capable of planting them 3 inches deep to get moisture at 3 inches deep? So in a lot of cases, we would struggle to be able to get them into moisture that would sustain them long enough to get them emerged and out of the ground, no matter how deep we plant them in some cases now. And you're probably best off just to hope that sometime in the next week or two, we catch a 1/2 inch or better rain, which would be enough to get the seed that you've got. And I agree with you, Adam. They're viable seeds. The only scenario, and there's probably some out there that fall into this case. So if you had enough moisture to germinate and sprout and get some up and going, and then you've got some laying that look like the day you planted them laying in dry dirt, it's the in-between ones that I would be a little bit nervous about. So if you had some beans that were in dampness, but not really in moisture, and you had just enough moisture to initiate germination, so swell the seed and initiate germination, and then it dried out, that's a dead plant there. So if you're finding, kind of oblong kidney bean shaped seeds that are in dry dirt, that would scare me a little bit because there's probably a certain percentage of those that are dead. If they truly do look like they look the day you put them in the ground, nice, pretty, round, pearly, treated seeds or naked seed, if you weren't planting treated seed at that time, those are fine. But if you are digging up seeds that look like they got started and then dried out, especially if you can see any signs of a dried out root, or you can see a hypocotyl that started to come out and you dig that seed up and it's in dry soil, that's a dead plant. So there probably are a few that fall into that category. And if you find enough of those, that would maybe be a situation where, a replant might be warranted. But even if it is warranted under the circumstances, I still question, as dry as we are in some places at the surface, can you truly get them into moisture at this stage of the game, or are you better off to just put them in dry soil and let them wait till it does rain?
Yeah. The only other conversation we had, just to add to that, is, let's say they planted 140,000 at 2 weeks ago or whatever it was, and hadn't had a rain on them yet because they didn't get lucky. Is there reason to go out there and put some more beans in the ground simply because we're getting later to try and thicken the stand up?
So I guess the question there would be, I planted them on June 1st. And on June 1st, Adam and I told you that 140,000 was fine. If they lay in dry dirt till July 1st, Adam and I would not have told you that 140,000 was fine if you planted them July 1st. And it doesn't really matter when you planted them. What matters is when they come up. So if they come up a month later than you planted them, then yes, Adam's question is valid. And should we have more beans out there than we do? Yes. Is it going to be worth the effort to go back and add them at that point? I don't know. If it was easy to do, in theory, yeah, I'd probably do it. But if it's not easy to do, if you've got the planter cleaned up and painted up and put away and it's service for next spring and you don't want to dig it back out of the shed, I get it. I probably wouldn't either in that scenario. But in a perfect world, yes. If you're June 1st planted soybeans that lay in dry soil for 30 days and then come up on July 1st, if you dropped them at 140 because we told you that was enough for June 1st, which it was, but it's not enough for July 1st. So if you want to err on the side of being conservative, an extra 50, 60, 70,000 seeds out there added to the 140 that you put out there in early June, would technically be better.
Kind of an interesting scenario there that a few guys had going on that we talked about. But hey, we got a question that came in from Merle Bettel, and he's wanting to know about early insect pressure in soybeans. Seeing any reports anywhere or having anybody telling you that they're having issues?
Yeah, I have had several reports of that. So thanks for the question, Merle. And bean leaf beetle was probably the most common question we were getting if you did not use a neonic insecticide on your soybeans. So that would be a gaucho or a poncho type product. That Swiss cheese look to soybeans. I actually think we had a conversation maybe 2 weeks ago about thresholds for treatment. We did have a pretty active first generation feeding of bean leaf beetle. The other, reality is those insecticide seed treatments only last so long. And if you planted your soybeans, April 5th, there's really no insecticide left in those fields. So you could be seeing some insect feeding even on insecticide treated seed, just because we've had 10 inches of rain and passage in 90 days since some of the beans went in the ground, and you're really not going to still be getting protection. So I haven't seen any scenarios where I thought fields need to be treated for insect feeding, but there are certainly bean leaf beetles out there. Thistle caterpillar is something that we've seen a lot of in recent years, and might be something to watch for here relatively soon, showing up in bean fields. Our late season insect feeders in soybeans probably cause me more concern because it has a bigger impact on yield and quality. So things like stink bug that will feed on pods, and those piercing, sucking mouth parts that'll they'll insert their proboscis right into the pod and can damage the pod, kill seed. Can have more of a direct impact on yield, and then we'll have multiple generations of bean leaf beetles. So I'm a big fan of insect control in soybeans for maximizing yield potential. Haven't seen a scenario yet where I think it would be warranted to apply an insecticide in soybeans, but I do think having the insecticide on the seed treatment is a good place to start. Having insecticide with your R3 fungicide is a very good practice, and then being prepared, through scouting and keeping an eye on things for a second application of insecticide post later in the season, if warranted, is a good thing to be prepared for.
Yeah.
So appreciate the questions.
Yeah, thanks, Merle, for the question. Appreciate it. Had a lot of other questions that everybody's been talking about with herbicide applications right now.
Yeah.
Do I need to make a second pass on my corn? What sort of weed pressure am I comfortable with leaving out there?
Yeah.
Should I make that pass? Should I not?
Yeah.
And then of course we got to talk about dicamba and applications and soybean, and what this dry weather, how that works in conjunction with our dicamba beans and our dicamba application.
Right. So a lot of layers to that onion. We're sitting here at June 17th, which, by the way, is my wedding anniversary. So happy anniversary, honey. For 21 years of putting up with me. The woman deserves some sort of an award of some kind. So I would be remiss if I didn't remember that. So here we are. We're 3 days from the last day to legally apply dicamba in soybeans in the state of Illinois. A couple of those days are forecasted temperatures that will keep us out of application. So hopefully you've got your dicamba on your beans. If you've still been waiting for the perfect wind day to get that on, just be aware that your number of days remaining are limited to get that perfect wind application. This has been a challenging June for sprayers. There's been a lot of, I would say, abnormal for the time of year wind days. Generally it's hard to get anything other than a southwest wind this time of year. And I know, talking to my retail applicator, he's got several thousand acres yet to cover. Well, not yet to cover, but he'd been struggling to get sprayed here over the last week because he was waiting for a southwest wind. And usually a southwest wind is not something you have to wait for. It's just what you get this time of year. But we've had a lot of days with north winds and some kind of oddball wind directions. And so, spraying is just far different than it used to be when the only thing you had to worry about was wind speed. Now we have to worry about wind speed and direction as well as air temperature. So it's just more challenging to get those herbicide applications made. I do, really, really like scenarios where we were able to use dicamba post because of its dry weather residuals. So one of the biggest challenges we have with post-emergence applications is getting those post-applied pre's activated. So all of our true pre's, so whether some sort of group 15 typically is what we're talking about, or if you're using some PPOs post or the PPO chemistry, all requires pretty significant moisture for activation. So if you're spraying Warrant or Warrant Ultra on dry soil, that's effectively useless until you get half-inch of rain or more to get that herbicide activated. That's where dicamba is a huge benefit to you because the dicamba residual is best in a dry soil scenario. I remember in 2012 when we were doing some of the first post-emergence trials at Monmouth with dicamba applications, we had pretty good residual control for about 6 weeks out of dicamba at Monmouth in the summer of 2012 because it was dry. You wouldn't get any residual activity out of a PPO or a group 15 if you were in a drought scenario. But you do get a lot of residual control with dicamba. So it's nice to have both of them there. You can have the dicamba kind of hold stuff back while it's dry. And then as soon as you get that half-inch, whatever rainfall you get to activate that pre, that's going to largely deactivate the dicamba because of its high water solubility, but it's going to initiate activity of the true pre that hopefully you applied when you were making that application. So, dry weather challenges weed control really several different ways. It's slowing the growth of the crop, which is delaying our canopy. It is making the weeds tougher to kill that are there. There's a lot of dust. If you watch a sprayer going through a field, dust will pretty effectively deactivate about any herbicide. And that's why sometimes when we're spraying in dusty field conditions, it's harder to get weed control. Kind of a double whammy. If the weed's under drought stress, it's tougher to kill anyway. If the weed's covered in dust or there's a coating of dust kicking around behind the sprayer, that really adds insult to injury. And then the other thing that dry weather messes with our weed control on is you don't get those activating rains to activate those post-emergence applied pre's. And so those are some of the challenges with weed control relative to dry weather. It's been a challenging spray season, not just from the aspect of, how many days do we have to spray? What direction's the wind blowing? What did my neighbor plant? What did this neighbor plant? How are we all going to coexist together with our different systems? We've also had product shortages on top of all that to manage. And so depending on what system you choose, you may have experienced that or you may not have, but just if you haven't experienced that, just know that there are people that are dealing with that. And some of those product shortages did drive some people to, choose to spray more dicamba post than they were maybe planning to when they planted, which in some cases created other issues. If you weren't planning on using dicamba post and you were planting several different systems of soybeans and you maybe weren't keeping them separate as well as you could have during the planting process because you didn't really care at that time because you weren't planning on using dicamba post anyway. And then you find yourself in a situation either due to the presence of a weed like mare's tail. So little spoiler alert here for you. If you had emerged mare's tail in a field that you used anything but dicamba on, they're still there. So mare's tail will be the bane of some people's existence this summer who tried not to use dicamba post. You want your friend dicamba with you when you're trying to kill mare's tail post-emergence in a soybean field. So a little note for next year. So this will fall into that category. Can't fix it now, but we can do a better job for next year. If you plan to not use dicamba post in soybeans next year, do a fall burn down and kill your mare's tail in the fall, or make sure you're loaded for bear with your early spring burn down so that you don't have a mare's tail to kill post. Because if you have mare's tail to kill post, 2,4-D, Liberty, and Roundup ain't going to cut it. So just a word of caution. So back on other things weed control related. So even though June 20th is coming up, we're going to be cutting off dicamba applications post and soybeans. We do still have the opportunity to apply Liberty. Now, Liberty technically is not supposed to be applied after flowering. 2,4-D should not be applied after flowering. Glyphosate should not be applied after R2, which is full flower. So really, all of these products are getting close to what their label would say is we should not be making applications. And if you're spraying an R3 fungicide, there should never be a herbicide attached to the ride with the R3 fungicide. Not saying it doesn't happen, but when it does, it's off label. So just be aware of that. Volunteer corn, I think will probably start to rear its ugly head again as well. Maybe in some cases you're frustrated. You've been spending money trying to kill it and you haven't been. So you said, screw it. How ugly can it get? It can get pretty damn ugly. So unfortunately, we all kind of lose our nerve when we see how bad that field gets. We thought, there's not much out there. I can get by without trying to control that. Or maybe you did try to control it, but antagonism from something else in the load, or a lack of adjuvant, or maybe stressful conditions or dust or whatever impacted the level of control that you get on volunteer corn. I've seen some fields that are going to get pretty ugly with volunteer corn if we fail to control it. So just some other things to be aware of. And one last thing I will say, weed control related. We did have some growers that got pretty frustrated last year. They sprayed dicamba early and then had a late season flush of grass, velvet leaf, cockleburr, not a lot of water hemp generally, because we were loaded for bear with water hemp with our residual programs. But you're not going to get, it's actually easier to get residual control of water hemp than it is cockleburr and velvet leaf. And if you've got surface germinating grass, it's pretty hard to control that late season as well with a residual. So keep in mind that even though you can't spray dicamba after June 20th, if the only thing in your field is grass, volunteer corn, velvet leaf, and cockleburr, you don't need dicamba for any of that. All you need is glyphosate for that. And hopefully, if you can still find some, you can make a late season application of glyphosate if you need to clean those fields up. And I would have to say this kind of gets into Adam's question about, what level of weed control are we striving for? So I observed on my own farm this year where we had, no-till corn into bean stubble on some fields that got a little woolly late in the season, field edges, along the waterways, places where I had a level of weed control that I thought was probably good enough to protect yield. Not landlord quality weed control, but yield protection quality level of weed control. When the pre's broke in corn and we couldn't get post-emergence applications made timely in May because it was raining all the time, that corn about got sodded in where it was growing in those places. So the level, and I'll also tell a story, a grower that I work with, a friend of mine he grows all conventional soybeans. And so he's living in a different world than most of us are. He has observed that if he has perfect weed control of corn, it's far easier for him to get an acceptable level of weed control in his conventional soybeans. If his corn gets a little woolly, he's got no chance of having a clean bean field with the program that he's on. So he'd been on a one-pass program in corn for several years and had actually been quite happy with it. But he went to a two-pass program in corn because he has realized that to enable him to grow the beans he wants to grow, he has to have perfect weed control in corn. So the level of weed control that you get in your corn absolutely affects the weed pressure that you'll feel in your soybeans the following year, and vice versa. So, we do a lot of things for cosmetic reasons here in Illinois. We have a lot of fields that are perfectly clean, and perfect is our standard. Perfectly clean is not always economically justifiable, and it's not always necessary from a yield protection standpoint, but it does reduce the seed bank. It does reduce the weed seed pressure that you'll feel the following year. So I can't answer the question for you, what level of weed control do you need, but just be aware that when weeds produce seed in your field, that is going to increase the weed pressure on next year's crop as well.
Absolutely agree. Hey, we're under the 5-minute warning here,
yes,
everyone. And
when the agronomist doesn't shut up, the producer can't give the 5-minute warning. So.
But if you've got any questions, please chat them in to us via YouTube. You can do it on Twitter. You can email or text or talk to your rep. Try to get them in. If we don't get to your question this time, we'll definitely put it on the docket for the next Ask the Agronomist, which is on July 1st.
All
so
right.
July 1st, we'll be back with Ask the Agronomist.
Hopefully talking about all the rain that we've received in the last
absolutely
last 2-week period.
Absolutely. Hopefully get a little rain between then and now. So that would be awesome. And make sure, if you like this type of information, tell somebody about it, share it with your friends. You can click the notification bell if you subscribe and get an update. It will ding on your phone whenever we're going to do Ask the Agronomist. But as you know, these videos are always put on our YouTube page, so you can go back and view them anytime. But give us a like and put in the comments any questions or anything that comes up when you're watching the video so we can try to address it. This is our way of trying to give to specifically the Western Illinois area some very timely information and agronomic conversation. So
one other thing I did want to touch on, this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's unfortunately a real scenario, and that would be the amount of wildlife damage that we're already seeing in some fields. So I had, for the first time ever, and this was verified, based on observations from the farmer and the landowner, a situation where raccoons were digging up planted seeds just to eat the seed, and digging up germinated seedlings just to eat the seed off of the root system. If you've been out in the woods lately, I've been mowing hay along a lot of fields with timber. The mulberry crop has to be near record. I mean, mulberries are literally raining off the mulberry trees. Why any coon would be so stupid as to go to the trouble to dig up a damn old dry, hard corn seed when he could be sitting underneath a mulberry tree on his you-know-what, just picking mulberries up off the ground, is beyond me. I've had calls on deer, eating soybeans. So we used to think about, soybeans not being as impacted by wildlife as much, and we used to always talk about deer and corn. I'm seeing some sort of shift going on. I'm pretty sure there's dark forces at work here that animals are modifying their habits, and I was joking with a retailer friend of mine that hopefully raccoons aren't adapting like corn rootworm did to rotation, and they're adapting to where they don't want to have to live on mulberries. They're going to live on corn instead. And we've been suffering a lot of coon damage in fields, corn at the roasting ear stage. This is the first I've ever had a situation where they're damaging a field earlier in the season when it doesn't even have an ear on it at that point in time. So I am a little nervous about the level of coon damage that we'll see in some fields later on this summer. And I'm concerned about the level of deer feeding that we'll see in soybeans. I did have a situation last year. This was in Fulton County, kind of an odd situation where we had an isolated soybean field that was surrounded by, near as we could tell, it was the only field of beans within a 2-mile radius of where this field was. And the deer literally ate the field to the point where it was difficult for the farmer to convince his crop adjuster that he had ever planted soybeans in the field. When they sprayed the field post, the beans were there. A month later, bare dirt. And, they were, there was tracks and deer feces scattered all over the field. It was not hard to tell what had happened to the beans, but it was, I'd really never seen anything quite like it. So a little bit nervous about the amount of wildlife damage that we might see here the rest of the summer, just with some of the early things I'm seeing. So just another thing to be aware of. There's no good solution to those problems, unfortunately, but just something that we'll have to maybe learn to live with a little more than we would like. So with that, I want to give a shout out to our friends here at Yetter Manufacturing in Macomb, Illinois, for use of their facility. We're over time, and producer Jennifer is standing here ready to give me the hook. So when she's standing there ready to hit the button that says end stream, that means I'm done. So thanks for joining, and we'll be with you here in 2 weeks. Thanks.
Wonderful.